welcome back. Tonight we're not exactly visiting paradise. Think less sunny beach and more, well, let's just say your nose won't thank you. We're plunging headfirst metaphorically, please, into the aromatic adventures of a 19th-century sanitation worker. But before we get into the grit, literally, let's set the scene, shall we? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes if you like. Imagine a city. Not the sleek, sanitized metropolis of today, all gleaming steel and orderly streets. No, this is a beast of a city, a living, breathing, and undeniably smelly organism. A place teeming with life, yes, but also choked by its own waste. The year is, let's say 1850. Pick a city, any city, London, Paris, New York. They all shared a certain pungency. As you stroll, or perhaps stagger down the main thoroughfare, the first thing that hits you isn't the sights, though those are certainly memorable. It's the smell. Imagine a symphony of stink, a cacophony of odor. It's not just one thing, mind you. It's a layered, complex aroma, a carefully curated blend of, well, let's break it down. First, there's the omnipresent scent of horses, not the pleasant, horsey smell of a clean stable, but the overwhelming stench of manure, heaps of it, everywhere. The streets are paved, if you can call them that, with a thick layer of it. Horses were the engines of this era, and they left their mark, quite literally, on every corner. It's unavoidable, it's under your feet, it's kicked up into the air with every passing carriage. You can almost taste it. Then, there's the smell of humanity, unwashed humanity. Bathing wasn't exactly a daily ritual back then, especially for the working class. Think layers of sweat, stale clothing, and a general earthiness. It's a potent aroma, particularly noticeable in crowded areas like markets or factories. Personal hygiene, or the lack thereof, contributed a significant layer to the overall urban bouquet. Now, let's add in the industrial element. Coal smoke belching from factories and homes, a thick, acrid cloud that hangs heavy in the air, coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Tanneries releasing the potent fumes of leather processing. Breweries with their yeasty, almost sour tang. Soap factories, ironically, producing something that was supposed to remove smells, but often adding their own unique brand of intensity. And of course, we can't forget the rivers. The rivers. Once lifelines of the city, now, well, open sewers. Human waste, animal carcasses, industrial effluent, everything ended up in the river. The Thames, the Seine, the Hudson, they were all to varying degrees cesspools. The smell rising from them was indescribable. Imagine stagnant water, rotting organic matter, and a hint of decay, a truly unforgettable experience. And don't even think about drinking from them. But wait, there's more, because we haven't even addressed the garbage, or rather, the lack of garbage disposal. People threw their waste, food scraps, broken pottery, whatever they didn't want, directly into the streets. Piles of refuse festered in alleyways, attracting rats, flies, and other unpleasant companions. The smell of rotting food mingled with the other odors, creating a truly unique olfactory experience. And then, the pièce de résistance, the privies. Before widespread indoor plumbing, most homes relied on outhouses, or privies. These were often overflowing, poorly maintained, and remarkably close to living quarters. The smell, well, I think you can imagine. Let's just say it wasn't pleasant. And emptying them? That was a whole other level of aromatic adventure, as we'll soon discover. So there you have it, a symphony of stink, a masterpiece of malodor. The 19th century city was a place where the sense of smell was constantly under assault. It was a constant reminder of the filth, the disease, and the sheer unpleasantness of urban life. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely it couldn't have always smelled that bad. And you'd be mostly wrong. While there were undoubtedly moments of relative olfactory respite, a clean rain washing the streets, a brisk wind blowing away the coal smoke, the underlying stench was ever present. It was woven into the very fabric of city life. It was the background music of the 19th century. But the smells weren't just an annoyance, a mere inconvenience. They were a direct threat to public health. People understood, even if they didn't fully grasp the science, that foul odors were linked to disease. They believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases were spread by bad air. And while they didn't know about germs, they knew that living in such close proximity to filth was unhealthy. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, these were the constant companions of the 19th century city dweller. And sanitation workers, the men, and sometimes women who toiled in the muck and mire, were on the front lines of this battle against disease. Theirs was a thankless, often invisible job, but it was also vital. They were the unsung heroes, the guardians of public health, even if they didn't get much thanks for it. So as we delve deeper into the world of the 19th century sanitation worker, remember the smell. It was more than just an unpleasant odor. It was a symbol of the challenges, the dangers, and the sheer grittiness of life in a rapidly growing, often unsanitary city. And it was the reason these workers were so essential, even if they were also so unappreciated. Ready to get your hands dirty? Well, not literally, just figuratively, because things are about to get interesting. The sun hasn't even thought about peeking over the horizon yet, but for a 19th century sanitation worker, the day's already begun. Imagine a world before alarm clocks, before the gentle melodies of your phone nudging you awake. Instead, it's the rumble of carts in the distance, the shouts of other early risers, or maybe just the gnawing emptiness in your stomach that drags you from sleep, if you can even call it sleep. More likely, you're waking up on a straw-filled mattress, shared perhaps with family, in a cramped room of a tenement building. Tenement is putting it kindly. Think more along the lines of a poorly ventilated, often windowless space, where the air is thick with the smell of damp unwashed bodies, and the ever-present reminders of inadequate sanitation that cling to everything. It's a symphony of unpleasantness that assaults your senses before you even open your eyes. Forget stretching luxuriously. Every movement is a groan, a protest from muscles already weary from yesterday's labor. Your back aches, your hands are stiff and calloused, and there's a general feeling of weariness that settles deep in your bones. Years of hauling heavy loads, of breathing in foul air, and of simply existing in a state of constant physical exertion have taken their toll. You're probably not even middle-aged yet, but your body feels much older. The bedroom, if you can call it that, is likely shared with several other family members. Privacy is a luxury you can't afford. Maybe a thin curtain offers a semblance of separation, but the sounds, smells, and sheer proximity of others are a constant reminder that you're all in this together, crammed into this tiny space, all struggling to make ends meet. The conditions are less than ideal. Think damp walls, peeling paint, and perhaps even the occasional rat scurrying across the floor. Vermin are just a fact of life. Bedbugs are almost guaranteed companions, feasting on you as you sleep. Disease is a constant threat, lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce on anyone whose immune system is weakened by poor nutrition and exhaustion. Getting dressed is a simple affair. You're likely wearing the same clothes you wore yesterday, and probably the day before that. Cleanliness is a rare treat, and clothing is often patched and worn thin. A simple woolen shirt, sturdy trousers, and heavy boots. These are the uniform of the working class. Comfort isn't a consideration. Durability is key. You need clothes that can withstand the rigors of the day's work. Clothes that can protect you somewhat from the grime and filth you'll be wading through. There's no hot shower waiting for you, no luxurious lathering with scented soap. Washing is a quick, perfunctory affair, using cold water from a shared basin. Maybe you'll splash some water on your face and hands, just enough to feel slightly less grimy. A quick swipe with a rough cloth, and you're as clean as you're likely to get until the end of the day, if you even have time for that. Then it's time for breakfast. Or, more accurately, the semblance of breakfast. Food is scarce and often of poor quality. Maybe you'll have some stale bread, perhaps dipped in weak coffee if you're lucky. Coffee is a precious commodity, a small luxury that can provide a much-needed boost to face the day ahead. But more often than not, it's a weak, watery brew, barely enough to cut through the morning fog. Maybe there's some porridge, a thin, watery gruel made from oats or whatever grains are available. It's not exactly a feast, but it's something to fill the emptiness in your stomach and provide a little bit of energy for the grueling hours ahead. Forget fresh fruit, forget vegetables. Those are luxuries you can't afford. As you eat, you're likely surrounded by your family, all sharing the same meager meal, all facing the same uncertain future. There's a quiet desperation in the air, a silent understanding that you're all in this together, all struggling to survive in a world that seems determined to keep you down. The physical toll of this lifestyle is immense. It's not just the aches and pains of hard labor, it's the constant exposure to disease, the poor nutrition, and the sheer exhaustion that wears down your body and spirit. Sanitation workers had a notoriously short lifespan, succumbing to illnesses like cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions they were forced to navigate. They were also prone to accidents, injuries sustained while hauling heavy loads or navigating the dangerous city streets. And then there's the mental toll. The constant stress of poverty, the fear of illness, the knowledge that your job is one of the most despised and dangerous in the city. All of this weighs heavily on your mind. It's a constant struggle to maintain hope, to find some semblance of joy in a life that seems relentlessly grim. But somehow, you persevere. You get up every morning, you face the day's challenges, and you do your best to provide for your family. You find strength in your community, in the shared experiences of those around you. You find moments of camaraderie with your fellow workers, brief respites from the harsh realities of your job. As you step out of your tenement building and into the pre-dawn darkness, you take a deep breath, trying to steel yourself for the day ahead. The air is thick with the smells of the city, a mixture of coal smoke, sewage, and unwashed bodies. It's not a pleasant smell, but it's the smell of your life, the smell of the city you call home. You adjust your hat, grab your tools, and head towards the sanitation yard, ready to begin another day of hauling waste, cleaning streets, and fighting against the tide of filth that threatens to engulf the city. It's a hard life, a thankless job, but it's your job, and you'll do it because you have to, because your family depends on you, because somehow you have to find a way to survive. The day has begun, and there's no turning back. All right, settle in, because we're about to talk about the least glamorous, most unpleasant job imaginable in the 19th century, collecting night soil. Now that's a delicate term for, well, human waste. You see, before widespread indoor plumbing and sewage systems became the norm, people relied on chamber pots or outhouses, and someone had to empty those. That someone was often the sanitation worker, drawing the short straw for what was undoubtedly the worst task in an already tough profession. Imagine this, it's the dead of night, pitch black in many cases, because street lighting was still pretty limited in most cities. Our sanitation worker, maybe let's call him Thomas, is making his rounds. He's got his heavy boots on, trudging through the narrow, often muddy streets. The air is thick with the usual city smells, rotting food, animal manure, industrial fumes, but overlaid with a particularly pungent, well, aromatic layer from overflowing cesspools and unemptied privies. Thomas isn't working alone. He's got a partner, or maybe a whole team, because this isn't a one-person job. They're navigating alleyways, knocking on doors, or sometimes just letting themselves into backyards, depending on their arrangement with the residents. Now, the night soil itself wasn't always neatly contained. Chamber pots overflowed, outhouses leaked, and sometimes people just didn't bother with either, especially in the poorer neighborhoods. So Thomas and his crew were often dealing with a veritable slurry of human excrement, mixed with whatever else happened to be lying around. Ashes, food scraps, dead animals, you name it. Pleasant image, isn't it? Their tools weren't exactly high-tech either. We're talking about buckets, shovels, and maybe a hand-drawn cart to haul everything away. The buckets were often leaky, and the carts weren't much better at containing the cargo. Spillage was common, and believe me, nobody wanted to be downwind when that happened. Can you even begin to fathom the aroma? It's hard to describe, something that would make you wish you could just unsmell something. And it wasn't just the smell. This stuff was teeming with disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all spread through fecal contamination. Thomas and his colleagues were constantly exposed, making them incredibly vulnerable to these deadly illnesses. They knew what was happening, yet there was little to nothing that they could do. You might be thinking, why didn't they wear protective gear? Well, the idea of personal protective equipment, or PPE as we call it today, was pretty much non-existent back then. Maybe they had some gloves, but likely not. Face masks? Forget about it. They were breathing in the fumes, getting splashed with the waste, and basically swimming in a sea of germs every single night. Now imagine the residents' reactions. Some were grateful, even polite. They understood the importance of the job, even if they didn't want to think about it too closely. Others were less so. They saw Thomas and his crew as dirty, undesirable, unnecessary evil perhaps. They might slam doors, offer insults, or just generally treat them with disdain. After all, nobody wants to be reminded of where their waste ends up, especially when it's being handled by someone they consider to be beneath them. And then there were the dogs. Oh, the dogs. Stray dogs were a common sight in 19th-century cities, and they weren't exactly friendly. They were often hungry, aggressive, and territorial. Trying to maneuver a cart full of night soil through a pack of snarling dogs was just another delightful challenge in Thomas's workday. He'd hope he could deter the dogs, but sometimes it was a lost cause. Despite all this, Thomas and his fellow night soil collectors did this, night after night, week after week. It was a tough, thankless job, but it was essential. Without them, cities would have been overwhelmed by disease and filth. Of course, dumping the collected waste was another issue entirely, which we will get to a bit later, but let's just say it wasn't exactly an environmentally friendly process. Rivers and waterways were often used as convenient dumping grounds, leading to further pollution and health problems. But for now, just picture Thomas slogging through the night, battling smells, disease, dogs, and social stigma, all to keep the city from drowning in its own, well, you know. It was hard work, dangerous work, and absolutely vital work. Something that most people take for granted today. What a job, huh? Alright, so imagine you're a sanitation worker in, say, 1850s London or New York. Pretty grim job, right? But how grim exactly? Well, let's talk about the tools of your trade, the things you'd be relying on to keep the city from drowning in its own filth. And believe me, they weren't exactly state-of-the-art. First off, the trusty bucket. Now, not some fancy galvanized steel thing. Think rough-hewn wood, maybe reinforced with iron bands if you were lucky. These were your primary vessels for collecting, well, everything. Night soil, which, euphemistically, is human waste. Garbage from the streets. Rotting food. Dead animals. Anything and everything that needed to go went into the bucket. And these buckets, they weren't exactly sealed tight. Gaps, cracks, splinters, all lovingly contributing to the symphony of smells that followed you everywhere. And of course, the weight. A full bucket of night soil, whew. We're talking easily 50 pounds, maybe more, depending on how enthusiastic the previous users of the chamber pot had been. And you're lugging these things often up flights of stairs in cramped tenements, down narrow alleyways, all the while trying not to spill any. Spillage. We can't forget the spillage. No matter how careful you were, some of that cargo was bound to escape. A jolt here, a bump there, and suddenly you're leaving a trail of olfactory unpleasantness in your wake. And believe me, the citizens weren't shy about expressing their displeasure. Shouts, glares, and the occasional hurled insult were all part of the job. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a health hazard. Those spills attracted flies, rats, and other vermin, spreading disease and making the already unsanitary conditions even worse. You were literally spreading the filth you were trying to remove. Irony, huh? And the weather. Rain turned the streets into muddy rivers, making it even harder to maneuver and increasing the risk of accidents. Snow and ice turned them into treacherous skating rinks. And in the summer, the heat. The stench intensified, the flies swarmed, and the work became even more grueling. There was no escape. And let's not forget the dangers of the job itself. You were dealing with potentially hazardous materials, sharp objects, broken glass, discarded medical waste. Anything could be lurking in those piles of refuse. Cuts and scrapes were common, and infections were a constant threat. The carts themselves were a hazard. A runaway cart could cause serious injury or even death. Collisions with other vehicles were always a risk, and the horses, while essential, were unpredictable animals. A sudden spook could lead to chaos and injury. Navigating the city streets as a 19th-century sanitation worker wasn't just a job, it was a daily gauntlet, a test of strength, endurance, skill, and sheer willpower. It was a constant battle against the environment, the crowds, and the inherent dangers of the work itself. These men weren't just cleaning up the city, they were battling it for survival, one precarious cartload at a time. So next time you see a garbage truck, maybe give a little nod of respect to the people doing the job, and the poor fellas who did it with so much less. They earned it. Okay, so imagine this, you're toiling away, knee-deep in muck, under the relentless summer sun, trying to keep a city from drowning in its own filth. You're a sanitation worker in the 19th century. Grueling work, right? But believe it or not, the physical hardship might only be half the battle. What about how society saw you? Being a sanitation worker wasn't exactly a career path you bragged about at parties, if you even got invited to parties, that is. The social stigma attached to the job was, well, pretty intense. These were the invisible men, and occasionally women, of the city. They were essential, sure, keeping disease at bay, but nobody actually wanted to see them, talk to them, or even acknowledge their existence if they could help it. Think of it like, well, like that feeling you get when you really need to take out the trash, but you put it off as long as humanly possible. That's kind of how society treated these workers. The root of this prejudice was simple. Dirt. People, then as now, associated cleanliness with virtue, with success, with being good, and if cleanliness was good, then dirt, by extension, was bad. And who dealt with all the dirt? Sanitation workers. So almost by default, they were relegated to the lowest rung of the social ladder. It's unfair, obviously, but that was the reality. It's the old idea of guilt by association taken to a whole new level. This social ostracization manifested in all sorts of ways. For starters, housing. Sanitation workers often lived in the poorest, most overcrowded, and unsanitary districts of the city, right alongside the very filth they were trying to combat. Landlords were less likely to rent to them, and if they did, it was often at inflated prices. Why? Because nobody wanted a sanitation worker living next door, bringing the stink and the perceived social degradation with them. It created a vicious cycle. Low wages, poor housing, and constant exposure to disease made it incredibly difficult for these workers to escape their circumstances. Then there was the issue of employment. Securing any job beyond sanitation was tough. The stigma followed them. Employers, even for unskilled labor, often preferred someone cleaner, someone without the taint of the refuse heap clinging to them, whether literally or figuratively. Think about it. If you're hiring someone to work in your shop or your factory, are you really going to choose the guy who spends his days shoveling night soil? It wasn't fair, but that's how things worked. Even something as simple as buying food could be a humiliating experience. Shopkeepers might be reluctant to serve sanitation workers, or they might charge them higher prices. Again, it was all about avoiding contamination, both physical and social. The assumption was that these workers were somehow inherently unclean, disease-ridden, and therefore undesirable customers. And let's not forget the impact on their families. The children of sanitation workers faced prejudice in schools, often being bullied or ostracized by their classmates. Their parents' profession became a source of shame and embarrassment. It limited their social opportunities, their chances for a better education, and ultimately, their prospects in life. It was a burden they carried, not of their own making. Romance. Well, good luck finding a respectable partner if you were a sanitation worker. The social gap was often too wide to bridge. Marriage prospects were limited, and even if they did find someone willing to look past the stigma, they still faced disapproval from their partner's family and community. Love, it seemed, wasn't always enough to overcome societal prejudice. It's not like people were completely unaware of the importance of sanitation work. They knew on some level that these workers were essential to public health. But that awareness rarely translated into respect or appreciation. Instead, there was a tendency to view them as a necessary evil, something to be tolerated but not celebrated. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. This lack of recognition took a heavy toll. It's hard to maintain a sense of pride in your work when you're constantly being treated like an outcast. It's demoralizing to know that you're contributing to the well-being of society, but society in turn looks down on you. The emotional burden of this social stigma undoubtedly contributed to the high rates of alcoholism, depression, and other mental health issues among sanitation workers. In a way, these workers were victims of a social catch-22. They were forced to perform a vital but deeply unpleasant task, and in doing so, they became social pariahs. It was a system that perpetuated inequality and reinforced existing prejudices. It was, in a word, unfair. They were trapped within a system, viewed as something less, something dirty by their mere existence. Now there were exceptions, of course. Some people recognized the inherent dignity of all labor, regardless of how unpleasant or unglamorous it might be. Some offered a kind word, a gesture of gratitude, or simply a moment of human connection. But these acts of kindness were rare, and they did little to change the overall social climate. The real tragedy, perhaps, is that this stigma persists to some extent even today. While we've made progress in recognizing the importance of sanitation and in professionalizing the field, there's still a tendency to undervalue the work of those who keep our cities clean. We might not be as overtly prejudiced as our 19th century counterparts, but subtle biases still exist. So next time you see a sanitation worker, take a moment to appreciate the work they do. Remember that they're not just removing garbage, they're contributing to public health, protecting our environment, and making our cities more livable. And more importantly, remember that they're human beings, deserving of respect and dignity, just like everyone else. Because at the end of the day, we all benefit from their labor, whether we acknowledge it or not. Alright, settle in. Because this part, it's not pretty. It's about the shadow that followed everyone in the 19th century, especially those who dealt with the city's leavings, disease, and inevitably, death. Think about it. You're wading through streets swimming in everything. Human waste, animal carcasses, rotting food. All that lovely organic matter is a breeding ground, a veritable 5-star hotel for bacteria and pathogens that back then people barely understood. They saw the connection, filth, then sickness. But the invisible enemy, it was a mystery, a scary one. Cholera. Just the name sends a shiver down the spine. It was a recurring nightmare in 19th century cities, a waterborne illness, meaning it thrived in the contaminated water sources that sanitation workers were constantly exposed to. You could be perfectly fine one morning, and by evening, you're gripped by violent vomiting and diarrhea, your body rapidly dehydrating. Your skin takes on a bluish hue, hence the lovely nickname, Blue Death. And it was fast. People died within hours. Imagine seeing that, often, knowing that any drink of water, any splash from the overflowing gutters, could be your last. It was a lottery nobody wanted to win. And what caused it? Well, polluted water. And who was tasked with dealing with that pollution? You guessed it, sanitation workers. They were the front line, the canaries in the coal mine. Only nobody was paying attention until it was too late. They were in the problem every single day. Typhoid fever was another ever-present threat. Again waterborne, again spread through poor sanitation. Symptoms: high fever, abdominal pain, weakness. Sounds charming, right? It could linger for weeks, sometimes months, debilitating its victims. And even if you survived, you could become a carrier, unknowingly spreading the disease to others. So you're constantly handling waste, knowing you could be infected, knowing you could infect your family. It's a weight few of us can imagine carrying. But it wasn't just cholera and typhoid. Oh no, dysentery was rampant. Diarrhea, fever, cramps. It sounds almost mild compared to cholera, but dysentery could be chronic, weakening you, making you susceptible to other infections. And let's not forget the less dramatic, but equally debilitating, constant stomach ailments. Cramps. That overall blah feeling that comes from breathing in and handling filth all day long. These weren't just abstract risks, mind you. These diseases ripped through communities, particularly the poorer neighborhoods where sanitation was at its worst. Sanitation workers living in those same neighborhoods were disproportionately affected. They lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, often sharing water sources with everyone else. No escape. Their families suffered, their children suffered. Death was a frequent visitor, a grim reality woven into the fabric of their lives. And let's talk about those injuries too. It wasn't all about invisible germs. These jobs were dangerous. Open wounds were practically an occupational hazard. A scratch from a rusty nail, a gash from a broken bucket. Any break in the skin was an invitation for infection. Tetanus or lockjaw was a terrifying possibility. Muscles stiffening, spasms, excruciating pain, and often death. Imagine working with heavy carts, hauling overflowing barrels, navigating treacherous streets. Accidents happened, limbs crushed, backs broken, and medical care limited, expensive, and often, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly state-of-the-art. A doctor might be worse than the disease sometimes. Amputation was common. Surgery was performed without proper sanitation or pain relief, and even a simple infection could turn deadly without antibiotics. Then there's the long-term effects. Think about breathing in all those fumes, all those particles, day after day, year after year. Respiratory problems were widespread. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, shortened lives. These men weren't just fighting disease, they were slowly suffocating, their lungs coated in grime. And the social stigma that added another layer of suffering. Sanitation workers were often ostracized, seen as dirty, untouchable. People avoided them, shunned them. They were invisible unless their stench preceded them. This social isolation compounded the physical and emotional toll of their work. Imagine the loneliness, the feeling of being less than human. So, when we talk about the lives of 19th-century sanitation workers, we can't sugarcoat it. Disease and death were constant companions. They lived under a cloud of fear, knowing that their job, essential as it was, put them directly in harm's way. It was a brutal reality, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the profound inequalities of the time. Alright, so imagine this, right? It's the 1800s. You've got all this waste, a lot of it. And well, where do you put it? Back then, the easiest, cheapest, and arguably most convenient solution was the river. Any river, really. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, the Schuylkill in Philadelphia. They all became basically open sewers. Think about it. You've got night soil, which as we talked about is basically human waste, being dumped directly into the river. You've got animal carcasses, because horses, cows, pigs, they die, and getting rid of them is a problem. Offal from butchers, the slops from your kitchen, everything. Into the river it goes. The idea at the time was that the river's flow would just carry it all away. Dilute it, make it disappear. Out of sight, out of mind, Problem solved, or so they thought. Now picture the river itself. It's not some clear babbling brook. It's thick, opaque, disgustingly colourful sometimes. Imagine the stench too. It's not just a bad smell, it's a physical presence. It hangs in the air, clings to your clothes, invades your home. You can taste it. And the consequences, they were devastating. First off, you've got the obvious. The water is completely undrinkable, unless you're really desperate and willing to risk everything. But even then, so what do people do? Well, they still need water. They wash their clothes in it. They sometimes even try to filter it to drink. That's basically just concentrating the nastiness. And that of course leads to disease. Horrific, rampant disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. All waterborne illnesses, thriving in those conditions. They spread like wildfire, especially in the poorer neighborhoods, where people are already weakened by malnutrition and overcrowding. These weren't just minor illnesses, either. They were killers. Cholera, especially, was a terrifying disease. You get hit with severe diarrhea and vomiting. And it dehydrates you so quickly. You could literally die within hours. Imagine that. And the worst part, they didn't really understand why people were getting sick. They knew something was wrong with the water. Sure, they could see it, smell it, taste it. But the link between the filth and the disease wasn't fully clear. Germ theory was still in its infancy, so they'd try things like cleaning up the smells, thinking that was the source of the problem. They'd use perfumes, or try to mask the odors with other, even stronger, smells, which I guess is kinda funny in a terrible way. They didn't know about bacteria, about viruses, about the actual microscopic organisms that were causing all the havoc. And so the cycle continued. People got sick from the water, and then, that went into the river too, making things even worse. A really vicious cycle. And it wasn't just humans suffering either. The rivers became dead zones, fish died, plants died, everything that relied on that water, gone. A whole ecosystem destroyed, all because of human waste. Think about the fishermen too, their livelihoods, their food source, poisoned, gone. The upper classes, the wealthy, they weren't completely immune of course, but they could afford to live further away from the worst areas. They could afford to buy cleaner water or build their own wells. They could afford better food and better medical care. So while they weren't entirely safe, they were definitely better off. It was really the working class, the poor, who bore the brunt of this environmental disaster. And it wasn't like they were completely ignorant, either. There were voices, even back then, raising concerns. Doctors, scientists, reformers. They were warning about the dangers of dumping waste into the rivers. They were advocating for better sanitation systems, for cleaner water supplies. But progress was slow, really slow. It took major outbreaks, massive death tolls, before people started to really listen. Even then, changes were often piecemeal and slow to be implemented. Politics, money, and just plain inertia all got in the way. So yeah, the river, not some romantic scenic waterway, but a cesspool of filth, disease, and death. A direct consequence of how society chose to deal with its waste. A grim reminder of the importance of sanitation, and the devastating impact of neglecting it. It's kinda hard to imagine now, isn't it? Just how bad things actually were. We take clean water for granted. We flush our toilets without a second thought. But back then, it was a whole different world. A world where the river was your toilet, your garbage dump, and often your grave. Okay, so, finding food, it wasn't exactly like popping down to the corner store for a quick bite, Imagine working all day, knee-deep in, let's just say unpleasantness, and then trying to find something, anything, to fill your stomach. It's not a pretty picture, really. For many sanitation workers, especially those scraping by on the lowest wages, regular meals were a luxury, a real luxury. Think about it. After a long, hard shift, the last thing you might want to do is put in extra work just to eat. What ends up happening is you got the family counting every penny, and food becomes this constant worry, like a low-grade fever always buzzing in the background. So, what were the options? Well, there was always scavenging. I know, sounds gross, right? And, honestly, it was gross. But desperation does funny things to people. Think about it though. In a city overflowing with waste, there was also inevitably discarded food. Maybe a merchant tossed out some bruised fruit, or a restaurant scraped leftovers into the alley. And while the well-to-do might turn their noses up, sanitation workers, they didn't really have that choice. Now, I'm not talking about perfectly good food, mind you. We're talking about stuff that was past its prime, nibbled on by rats, covered in flies, stuff most people wouldn't even feed to their dogs. But when you're hungry enough, you tend to lower your standards. And sanitation workers, they were always hungry. And I mean always. They'd have to be careful though. Eating rotten food could lead to, well, let's just say unpleasant consequences. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, these were all very real threats, and sanitation workers were already at higher risk because of their jobs. It's a nasty cycle to be caught in. The funny thing is, the places where you could find a meal were sometimes also the places you'd find work. Markets, slaughterhouses, even near the rivers they were dumping waste. It's like the smell of rot was also the smell of an opportunity, sad as that sounds. Some workers might try to supplement their diets by fishing in those same rivers though. Honestly, you'd have to be pretty brave, or desperate, to eat anything that came out of those waters. Think of all the waste seeping in, the dead animals, you get the idea. It's not a pleasant image, and what's worse is, it isn't even that far off from reality. And you know, it wasn't just the workers themselves, their families suffered too. Imagine being a mother, trying to feed your children on scraps and whatever your husband managed to scrounge up. It's a heavy burden to carry, real heavy. You're constantly worried, constantly stressed, and probably always feeling guilty, no matter how hard you're working. Now and then, a sympathetic butcher or baker might offer a discount on leftover scraps. A lot of times this wasn't out of pure charity. It might have been cheaper to sell to workers at a low price than have to deal with disposing of it properly. Still, it was a lifeline, you know, a small act of kindness that could make a real difference. Those little bits of humanity would matter to people. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine some idealized version of life in the 19th century. But the reality for sanitation workers was brutal. They were essential to the functioning of the city, but they were also treated like, well, like garbage themselves, you know. Overlooked, underpaid, and forced to scavenge for their next meal in the very waste they were paid to remove. And so, imagine the feeling of working hard to keep society going, only to be treated like you're less than dirt. That's got to do something to the soul, don't you think? So the next time you think about the food you're eating, maybe spare a thought for those sanitation workers of the 19th century. They didn't have much, but they kept the city running, one bucket of waste and one desperate bite at a time, and they did what they had to. I wonder if we could do the same. And now, let's turn our attention to the heart of this harsh reality, the families left behind. It's easy to get caught up in the grit and grime of the sanitation workers' daily toil, but we can't forget the human cost, the wives, children, and aging parents whose lives were inextricably linked to this often despised profession. Poverty was, without a doubt, the ever-present shadow lurking over these families. The wages earned by a 19th century sanitation worker were, to put it mildly, abysmal. We're talking about a pittance that barely covered the bare necessities of life, food, shelter, and perhaps a threadbare garment or two. Forget about any luxuries or even the basic comforts that we take for granted today. Imagine trying to stretch those meager earnings to feed a family of 5 or 6. Meat was a rare treat, reserved for special occasions if at all. The daily fare likely consisted of cheap grains, potatoes, and whatever vegetables could be scavenged or grown in a small, often unproductive, garden patch. Malnutrition was a constant threat, particularly for children. A lack of essential vitamins and minerals could stunt their growth, weaken their immune systems, and make them more susceptible to disease. Shelter too was a major concern. Sanitation workers and their families typically resided in the poorest, most overcrowded sections of the city. Tenements, those infamous multi-story apartment buildings, were often their only option. These buildings were notorious for their squalor, lack of ventilation, and general state of disrepair. Multiple families might be crammed into a single room, sharing inadequate facilities, and struggling to maintain even a semblance of cleanliness. Dampness and mold were rampant, creating a breeding ground for respiratory illnesses. Privacy was non-existent, and the constant noise and commotion made it difficult to rest or find any peace. And of course, let's not forget the ever-present threat of disease. Sanitation work, as we've discussed, was a hazardous occupation, exposing workers to a cocktail of pathogens and toxins. But the risk didn't end with the worker, it extended to his entire family. He could easily bring home cholera, typhoid, or other waterborne illnesses, infecting his loved ones and potentially leading to their death. The cramped living conditions in tenements only exacerbated the spread of disease. Once an illness took hold, it could quickly sweep through an entire building, leaving a trail of sickness and death in its wake. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high in these communities, with many children succumbing to preventable diseases before their 5th birthday. The constant fear of illness and death hung heavy over these families, casting a pall of dread over their already difficult lives. Then there's the question of opportunities, or rather the distinct lack thereof. For the children of sanitation workers, the prospects for a better future were bleak. The cycle of poverty was difficult to break. Many children were forced to leave school at a young age, if they even attended at all, to contribute to the family income. They might find work as street vendors, scavengers, or even in factories, toiling long hours for meager wages. Their bodies would be worn down from this perpetual labor, with little to no hope of developing skills for a high-paying job, and as such they would grow up as adults destined to sanitation work as well, just as their fathers had. For girls, the options were even more limited. Domestic service was a common path, but it offered little in the way of advancement or independence. Marriage was often seen as the only way to escape poverty, but it also meant becoming entirely dependent on a husband whose own prospects were often uncertain. Opportunities for education or professional training were virtually non-existent for women from this social class. The social stigma associated with sanitation work further compounded these challenges. The families of these workers were often ostracized and looked down upon by other members of the community. Their children might face discrimination in school or be excluded from social activities. This social isolation could lead to feelings of shame and hopelessness, making it even more difficult to escape the cycle of poverty. Think about the emotional toll this took on the sanitation worker himself. He knew that his job was essential to the functioning of the city, but he also knew that it was despised and undervalued. He bore the brunt of social stigma and risked his health every day, all for a wage that barely sustained his family. He likely felt a deep sense of responsibility for their well-being, but also a profound sense of helplessness in the face of their suffering. The weight of these burdens could be crushing, leading to despair, depression, and even substance abuse. Furthermore, the uncertainty of employment loomed large. Sanitation work was often contracted out to private companies, who prioritized profit over worker welfare. Contracts could be terminated at any time, leaving workers without a job and a source of income. Injuries or illnesses could also lead to unemployment, as there was no safety net to fall back on. In the absence of social security or unemployment benefits, these families were left to fend for themselves, often relying on charity or the kindness of strangers. And kindness was certainly not something common for the sanitation workers or their families. The plight of these families serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and social inequality. It highlights the importance of fair wages, safe working conditions, access to healthcare and education, and a strong social safety net. These are not just abstract policy goals, they are fundamental human rights that are essential for creating a just and equitable society. So next time you think about the sanitation workers of the 19th century, remember not just the filth and the stench, but also the families who struggled alongside them, dreaming of a better future that often seemed just out of reach. And let us work together to ensure that no family today has to endure such hardship and uncertainty. But even in the grim reality of a 19th century sanitation worker's life, there were whispers of respite, fleeting moments almost stolen, where the weight of the world, or rather the weight of the city's waste, lifted just a little. Imagine, if you will, the midday sun beating down mercilessly, reflecting off the cobblestones and intensifying the ever-present stench. The muscles in your back ache, your hands are raw, and the inside of your nose feels permanently coated in, well, you know, it's a common occurrence. But then a glint of hope. The foreman, a gruff but not entirely heartless man, might call for a brief halt. "All right, lads, 10 minutes. He'd bellow, his voice raspy from years of inhaling the same noxious fumes, and like a starting gun, that simple phrase would signal a collective sigh of relief. The carts would be abandoned, momentarily forgotten. Shovels and buckets would clatter to the ground as the workers sought out a sliver of shade, perhaps beneath the meager awning of a shop, or against the cool, damp brick of a building. Even in the middle of the most crowded street, they would find ways to stake a claim to those few minutes. These breaks were rarely luxurious. There were no comfortable chairs, no refreshing drinks, no soothing music, but there was rest, a chance to straighten a kinked back, to wipe a sweat-streaked brow with a soiled handkerchief, to simply breathe. And in those moments of quiet, something else began to bloom: camaraderie. These men, bound together by the shared hardship of their labor, forged bonds of kinship that transcended social barriers. They were, after all, in this together, every day. Conversations, often hushed and punctuated by coughs or spits, would begin. Talk of families, of dreams deferred, of the simple pleasures of life that seemed so far away. A wife's gentle smile, a child's playful laughter, the taste of fresh bread. Small things that, when recounted, took on a profound significance. Humor, too, played a crucial role. Dark, gallows humor, perhaps, but humor nonetheless. Jokes about the absurdity of their work, about the ridiculous characters they encountered in the city, about the sheer audacity of life itself. It was a way of deflecting the misery, of finding a spark of light in the overwhelming darkness. Sometimes a shared meal would emerge, a crust of bread, a chunk of cheese, a piece of salted pork, shared amongst the group, each bite a symbol of solidarity. Food that tasted all the better when enjoyed in the company of those who understood its true value. And there was an understanding that went beyond words. A shared glance, a knowing nod, a pat on the back, a silent acknowledgement of the burden they all carried and the strength they found in carrying it together. Because this job was hard, you had to carry your weight, and some extra. These weren't just co-workers, they were a band of brothers, forged in the fires of hardship, bound by a common purpose. They watched out for each other, offering a helping hand to those who stumbled, a word of encouragement to those who faltered. They knew that their survival, both physical and emotional, depended on their unity. These moments of respite, however brief, were a lifeline. They were a reminder that even in the midst of the most degrading circumstances, humanity could endure, that even the most despised and ostracized members of society could find dignity and connection in their shared struggle. And these moments built up over time. Perhaps one day, one of them would get lucky. Buy a little farm, start a small business. But until then, they knew the work was important. Someone had to do it, and they did. They showed up day after day, year after year. They didn't complain much, and they pulled their weight. They were there for each other, in the streets and in the dumps. The camaraderie was palpable, as strong as the fumes from the waste. They shared stories, and even if the stories weren't funny, they would laugh. The laughter helped to stave off the fatigue and hopelessness. The laughing made them human. They weren't heroes or villains. They were men, just trying to make a living and go home to their families. They wanted to be remembered, not as the night soil guys, but as people. Someone would always have a story about a kid, or a wife, or a friend. Always some story of hope. They were like a team, not just a group of workers. They were friends. They'd pat each other on the shoulder and joke about going off to the tavern. Maybe tonight would be the night they had a few pints. Of course, they said that every night. It's hard to imagine what it was like to live that life. To be the sanitation worker, covered in grime and waste, but with a twinkle in their eyes. Maybe that twinkle was from the gin, or maybe it was from the friendship. And then, all too soon, the foreman's bellow would shatter the peace. All right, lads, back to work. The signal to return to the grime, the stench, the endless labor. But the memory of those brief moments of rest and camaraderie would linger, a small spark of hope to fuel the long hours ahead. A spark that carried them through the day, a spark that made them smile, even through the smell. Okay, so picture this. You're living in a 19th century city, right? And maybe you've noticed things aren't exactly pristine. The smells are, well, let's just say memorable. And the streets, they're not exactly winning any cleanliness awards. Now, it wasn't like everyone was just blissfully ignorant of the potential problems. Slowly, very slowly, people were starting to connect the dots between all that muck and mire and the diseases that kept popping up. We're talking cholera, typhoid, dysentery, the kinds of illnesses that could wipe out entire neighborhoods in a heartbeat. Think about it. You've got raw sewage overflowing into the streets, contaminating the water supply. People are drinking that water. Animals are drinking that water. It's a recipe for disaster, really. But here's the thing, even when some folks did realize what was going on, getting things changed was like trying to push a boulder uphill in molasses. There were a lot of reasons for this slow progress. For starters, understanding of germ theory was still pretty primitive. I mean, Louis Pasteur's work was starting to gain traction, but the idea that tiny little invisible organisms could make you sick, it was a tough sell for many. Invisible monsters? Nah, it's just bad air, I tell you. Then there's the whole out of sight, out of mind thing. If you were wealthy, living in a nicer part of town, you could pretty easily ignore the sanitation problems. Sure, the smell might waft your way on a bad day, but it wasn't your daily reality. And if it wasn't your problem, why spend money to fix it? This was especially true for the factory owners and other titans of industry. These people often held significant sway in local politics. To them, sanitation reform was seen as something that would cut into their profits. It meant higher taxes, potential disruptions to their business, and maybe even having to invest in new technologies or processes. And let's not forget the logistics. Building proper sewer systems, that's a huge undertaking. You're talking about digging up streets, laying miles and miles of pipes, figuring out where all that waste is going to go. It's expensive, disruptive, and takes a long time. Plus, who's going to pay for it? And then you have the issue of personal habits. People were used to doing things a certain way, throwing their waste into the street, tossing their slop buckets out the window. That's just how things had always been done. Trying to convince people to change their behavior, to start being more responsible with their waste, well, good luck with that. It was like trying to teach an old dog new tricks, you know? There was also a deep-seated sense of fatalism. Disease was just a part of life, something you couldn't really escape. It's God's will, people would say. If it's your time to go, it's your time to go. This attitude made it harder to convince people that sanitation improvements could actually make a difference. Why bother fighting it if it's all predetermined anyway? Now, it wasn't all doom and gloom. There were some people who were starting to champion the cause of public health. Doctors, reformers, social activists, they saw the connection between sanitation and disease, and they were determined to do something about it. But they faced an uphill battle, constantly fighting against apathy, ignorance and vested interests. These early public health advocates, bless their hearts, were working with limited resources and often faced resistance from those who didn't see the value in their efforts. They used persuasive arguments, leveraging scientific findings and moral appeals to raise awareness and advocate for change. But their pleas often fell on deaf ears or were met with skepticism. One of the biggest challenges was the lack of data. It was hard to prove that sanitation improvements were actually working when you didn't have reliable statistics on disease rates. Collecting that kind of data was a slow, painstaking process. Another hurdle was the social stigma associated with sanitation work. People didn't want to talk about waste, they didn't want to think about it, and they certainly didn't want to acknowledge the people who were responsible for dealing with it. This made it harder to raise awareness and build support for sanitation initiatives. But slowly, things did start to change. As cities grew and the sanitation problems became more acute, it became harder to ignore the issue. Cholera outbreaks, in particular, had a way of focusing people's attention. When a deadly disease starts spreading through your neighborhood, suddenly sanitation becomes a lot more interesting. Public awareness campaigns started to gain traction. Newspapers began publishing articles about the importance of hygiene and sanitation. Doctors gave lectures. Reformers organized public meetings. Slowly, people started to realize that sanitation wasn't just some unpleasant chore. It was a matter of life and death. New technologies also played a role. The development of improved sewer systems and water filtration methods offered practical solutions to the sanitation crisis. While these technologies were expensive and took time to implement, they showed that real progress was possible. Legislators and city officials began to see the writing on the wall. They realized that sanitation improvements weren't just a nice to have, they were essential for the health and prosperity of their cities. Slowly, laws and regulations were passed to improve sanitation practices. These early regulations often focused on the basics, requiring homeowners to connect to sewer lines, regulating the disposal of waste, and cleaning streets regularly. While these measures were often limited and imperfect, they represented a significant step forward. The establishment of formal sanitation departments was another key development. These departments were responsible for overseeing sanitation services, enforcing regulations, and educating the public about hygiene. This marked a shift from a haphazard, ad hoc approach to a more organized, professional one. Of course, progress was slow and uneven. Some cities were quicker to embrace sanitation reforms than others. And even in cities that were making progress, there were setbacks and challenges along the way. But the seeds of change had been planted. The importance of sanitation was gradually becoming recognized, and the wheels of progress were slowly turning. And I suppose in a morbid kind of way, a cholera epidemic did more to push things along than almost anything else. More on that though next time. It's time to sleep now. Alright, let's talk about money, or rather, contracts. Because when you're dealing with mountains of someone's gotta pay someone to deal with it. The world of 19th century sanitation work wasn't some noble endeavor run by public-spirited folks, purely for the good of the city. No, it was a business. And like any business, it was driven by profit. This is where the bosses and the contracts come in. Most cities didn't have a dedicated city-run sanitation department, at least not in the early to mid-1800s. Instead, they relied on a system of private contractors. Think of it like today's garbage collection, but even less regulated. The city would divide itself into districts and then put out bids, offering contracts to whoever promised to remove the waste for the lowest price. Simple, right? Well, simple in theory. In practice, it often led to a race to the bottom, with contractors underbidding each other to win the contracts, then cutting corners wherever they could to actually turn a profit. And guess where those corners were cut? You guessed it, worker safety. See, those contracts were usually pretty vague. They'd specify, remove all refuse from this district, but they rarely got into specifics about how that refuse should be removed, how often, or what kind of equipment should be used. And definitely not things such as safety standards and worker health. This created a breeding ground for exploitation. A contractor might win a bid by promising to clear a district twice a week, but then to save money, only do it once. Or use smaller carts and fewer workers than needed, leaving the streets partially cleared. The city inspectors were often overworked, underpaid, or even, incentivized to look the other way. And the workers, they were at the very bottom of the food chain. The contractor squeezed them for every ounce of labor, paying as little as possible, providing minimal equipment, and ignoring their safety concerns. If a worker got injured, tough luck. There were plenty of other desperate souls willing to take his place. These bosses, who were these guys anyway? Well, they came in all shapes and sizes. Some were established businessmen who saw an opportunity to profit from the city's waste problem. Others were less reputable characters, perhaps with connections to the local political machine, able to grease the right palms to secure contracts. And of course, some were people trying to lift themselves out of their own poverty by managing the lowest rung of labor. Regardless of their background, most contractors shared one thing in common: a ruthless focus on the bottom line. They saw sanitation workers not as people, but as a cost to be minimized. The contract system also created a weird dynamic regarding what exactly constituted waste. See, the more waste there was, the more money the contractor made. This created a perverse incentive to not be too efficient. If a street was perfectly clean, there was no need to pay workers to clean it, right? So some contractors might actually encourage a certain level of mess, ensuring a steady stream of work. This wasn't just about laziness, it was about economic survival in a cutthroat industry. Competition was fierce, and margins were thin. A contractor who played by the rules, providing decent wages and equipment, might quickly find himself out of business, undercut by a competitor willing to stoop lower. And of course, the political side of all this was messy. The awarding of contracts was often subject to corruption and favoritism. A contractor with the right political connections could win a lucrative contract, even if his bid wasn't the lowest or his performance wasn't the best. These contracts were also often awarded based on ethnic lines. Certain immigrant groups found themselves stuck in the role of waste collectors, with their fellow immigrants acting as the middlemen. This wasn't necessarily because those ethnic groups were suited for the work, but rather due to cycles of poverty, discrimination, and lack of opportunity. And you have to consider that these contracts were often paid by residents, so you had citizens already in dire straits, often having to pay to have their waste removed, even if it wasn't. This isn't even getting into what constitutes waste, because for every load of night soil or industrial runoff, there was plenty that could be resold or reused. Things such as metals, bones, and fabrics could be sorted out and given a second life. In fact, the term rag and bone man or totters were terms for people who would go through people's trash, looking for items they could sell. Think of them like the people who recycle cans for money today. The sanitation contractors would often use them, either paying them pennies or even nothing for their effort. So the next time you see those gleaming modern garbage trucks rolling through your neighborhood, remember the 19th-century sanitation worker toiling in the muck, his health and safety sacrificed on the altar of profit. It's a stark reminder that even the most essential services can be tainted by greed and exploitation. And something to keep in mind next time you vote, perhaps. It is something perhaps to remind yourself of when you consider any service that is vital to the health and safety of society. Is that service being taken care of? Are the ones taking care of it being taken care of? Something to keep in mind The late 19th century was a time of tremendous upheaval. Cities were growing at an unprecedented rate, fueled by industrialization and immigration. But this rapid growth came at a cost. Overcrowding, poverty, and inadequate infrastructure created breeding grounds for disease. And those tasked with cleaning up the mess, the sanitation workers, often faced deplorable working conditions and next to no social or political power. It's easy to imagine that sanitation workers just quietly did their job. After all, it wasn't exactly a career path that attracted attention or admiration. But these were human beings, just like you and me, and when pushed to the limit, they responded in the same way anyone else would. They organized, they protested, they fought for a better life. However, organizing was incredibly difficult. Think about it. These men were often day laborers, scraping by on the bare minimum. Taking time off work to attend meetings meant losing precious income. And there was always the fear of being fired, blacklisted, and left with absolutely nothing. Their bosses and the companies they worked for held all the power and weren't afraid to use it. Another major obstacle was the social stigma associated with their work. They were seen as the lowest of the low, the untouchables of the city. This made it hard to garner public support for their cause. Who wanted to stand alongside the men who handled the city's filth? But despite these challenges, sanitation workers did organize. Early attempts were often small and informal. Workers would gather in secret, sharing grievances and discussing possible solutions. These meetings were usually held in the dead of night, in dimly lit taverns, or even in the very streets they cleaned. It was risky, and everyone knew it. But the desire for change was strong. One of the earliest recorded sanitation strikes took place in London in the 1840s. These weren't huge, city-stopping events. Small pockets of disgruntled workers refusing to work, hoping to affect local areas. These workers, mainly tasked with emptying cesspools and cleaning streets, demanded higher wages and better equipment. The strike didn't last long. The authorities quickly stepped in, threatening to arrest the strikers and replace them with scabs, replacement workers willing to do the job for less. The strike was broken, but the seed had been planted. Similar strikes and protests erupted sporadically throughout Europe and America in the following decades. In New York City, sanitation workers, often Irish immigrants, staged several walkouts in the 1870s and 1880s. They demanded better pay, shorter hours, and protection from the elements. They also protested the corrupt system of contracting, where political bosses awarded sanitation contracts to their cronies, who then squeezed workers for every last penny. These strikes were often met with violence. Police were called in to break up picket lines, and strikers were arrested on trumped-up charges. The press, often controlled by wealthy elites, portrayed the strikers as lazy, ungrateful, and even dangerous. It was an uphill battle. One of the key demands of sanitation workers was recognition of their essential role in keeping the city healthy. They argued that they weren't just cleaning up garbage, they were protecting the public from disease. They were keeping the city functioning. But this argument often fell on deaf ears. The prevailing attitude was that sanitation work was dirty and unpleasant, and therefore deserved low pay and little respect. Despite the lack of public support, some reformers and social activists began to take notice of the plight of sanitation workers. These individuals, often motivated by religious or humanitarian concerns, saw the connection between sanitation, poverty, and public health. They began to advocate for better working conditions and fair wages for sanitation workers. One notable figure was George Waring Jr., a civil engineer who became sanitation commissioner of New York City in the 1890s. Waring was a progressive reformer who believed that sanitation was essential for public health and social order. He famously organized the city's sanitation workers into a uniformed force, known as the White Wings, and instilled in them a sense of pride and professionalism. Waring also fought for better equipment, higher wages, and improved working conditions for his men. Waring's efforts were met with resistance from political opponents and entrenched interests. but he managed to make significant improvements in the city's sanitation system and elevate the status of sanitation workers. His work demonstrated that it was possible to improve both public health and the lives of those who cleaned the streets. The struggles of 19th-century sanitation workers also helped to pave the way for the rise of labor unions. As workers realized that they had little power as individuals, they began to form collective organizations to bargain for better wages and working conditions. Sanitation workers, like other laborers, joined unions and participated in strikes and protests to demand their rights. These early unions faced enormous challenges. They were often weak, underfunded, and targeted by employers and the authorities. But they provided a voice for workers who had previously been voiceless, and they laid the foundation for the modern labor movement. The fight for better conditions wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. It was about being treated like human beings, not just beasts of burden. It was about having the opportunity to earn a decent living and provide for their families. It was about being recognized for the essential role they played in keeping the city safe and healthy. The strikes and protests of 19th-century sanitation workers may not have always been successful in the short term, but they helped to raise awareness of the plight of these forgotten laborers and to lay the groundwork for future improvements. They also demonstrated the power of collective action and the importance of fighting for social justice. It's a slow climb towards being treated humanely, but these brave individuals took a step forward in pushing for that, even in the face of so much adversity. Okay, so picture this. You're a sanitation worker in, say, the mid-1800s, and every day is but even then, even amidst all that gestures vaguely, things were starting to shift. There was a dawning realization, a slow burn of an idea that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way. See, for centuries, the go-to method for dealing with human waste was, shall we say, rudimentary. Cesspools, outhouses, basically holes in the ground. And when those holes filled up, well, somebody had to deal with it. But as cities swelled in size, these old methods simply weren't cutting it. The problem was just becoming too big to ignore, even for those who preferred to, hold their noses and look the other way. This is where our story takes a turn for the slightly more optimistic. Enter, stage left, the humble sewer. Now, I know, sewers don't exactly scream innovation, but back then, they were revolutionary. Early sewer systems, especially in places like London and Paris, were a far cry from the massive interconnected networks we have today. They were often little more than covered ditches, designed to carry waste away from densely populated areas, ideally into the nearest river. Still, it was a start. These early sewers, though imperfect, offered a glimpse of a cleaner future. No more overflowing cesspools in the streets, no more wading through unpleasantness just to get to work. For sanitation workers, it meant a slight reduction in the directness of their engagement with the city's waste. Instead of hauling buckets of night soil, that's fancy talk for what you think it is, they could focus on clearing blockages and maintaining the flow of the sewers. Not exactly glamorous, mind you, but a definite step up. Of course, these early systems had their drawbacks. For one, they often emptied directly into rivers, leading to, let's just say, downstream communities weren't exactly thrilled, and during heavy rains the sewers could overflow, sending a torrent of, you get the picture, back into the streets. But progress, right? But the real game changer, the innovation that truly began to transform sanitation, was something we all take for granted today: the flushing toilet. I know, it's hard to get excited about a toilet, but trust me on this one. Before the flushing toilet, personal hygiene was, let's just say it wasn't exactly a top priority for most people. Outhouses were often located far from the house, especially during cold weather, which led people to use chamber pots, a nice, delicate name for a bucket kept under the bed. And that, A bucket would then need to be emptied. You guessed it, by sanitation workers. The invention of the flushing toilet, particularly the strap design by Alexander Cumming in the late 1700s, offered a private, convenient and relatively hygienic way to dispose of human waste. And while early flushing toilets were a luxury available only to the wealthy, their popularity grew steadily throughout the 19th century, slowly trickling down to the middle class, and even eventually to working-class homes. Think about the impact on the sanitation workers. Every household that installed a flushing toilet was one less household requiring night soil collection. It didn't eliminate the need for sanitation workers entirely, of course. Someone still had to maintain the sewers, clear blockages, and deal with the inevitable overflows. And in many areas, particularly poorer neighborhoods, outhouses and cesspools remained the norm for decades to come. But the trend was clear. The flushing toilet was slowly but surely revolutionizing sanitation. More importantly, perhaps, the rise of flushing toilets and improved sewer systems began to shift public perception of sanitation. It was no longer just a matter of individual convenience or aesthetics. It was becoming a matter of public health. As cities grew denser, the link between poor sanitation and disease became increasingly clear. Cholera outbreaks, typhoid fever epidemics, these were grim reminders of the consequences of neglecting waste management. And so, slowly, grudgingly, governments began to invest in sanitation infrastructure. Not out of the goodness of their hearts, mind you, but out of a growing realization that clean cities were healthier cities, and healthier cities were more productive cities. It was an economic calculation as much as a humanitarian one. This isn't to say that life suddenly became easy for sanitation workers. Far from it. They still faced long hours, dangerous conditions and social stigma. But the technological advancements of the 19th century, the humble sewer, the revolutionary flushing toilet, offered a glimmer of hope, a promise of a cleaner, healthier, and perhaps even slightly less gagging sound, odorous future. And that, my friends, is a promise worth something, even in the stinkiest of times. And it was just the beginning, the very first baby steps down a very, very long road. Progress, slow progress, but progress nonetheless. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's talk about how immigrant labor fueled the dirty work of keeping 19th century cities somewhat habitable. It's not a pretty story, but it's an important one. Now, when we picture these bustling cities of the 1800s, we often think of grand buildings, horse-drawn carriages, and maybe even top hats. What we don't usually picture are the legions of workers, often immigrants, toiling away in the shadows, dealing with the filth and disease that made those cities, well, cities. Think about it. Who wanted to do this job? Native-born citizens with options weren't exactly lining up to haul night soil or wade through overflowing sewers. So who was left? Immigrants, fresh off the boat, often desperate, and willing to take on jobs that no one else wanted. We're talking primarily about Irish immigrants, escaping famine and poverty back in Ireland, and later, Italian immigrants, seeking a better life than they had at home. They arrived in America with little more than the clothes on their backs and a willingness to work hard. And sadly, that willingness was often exploited. You see, these newcomers were incredibly vulnerable. They often didn't speak English well, if at all. They were unfamiliar with American laws and customs, and they were often targeted by unscrupulous employers who knew they could get away with paying them next to nothing. The sanitation industry became a haven, or rather, a trap, for these immigrant workers. It offered a way to earn some kind of living, but at a terrible cost. The pay was abysmal, barely enough to keep body and soul together. The hours were long, stretching from before dawn until well after dusk, and the work itself was, well, utterly disgusting and incredibly dangerous. These workers faced constant exposure to disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These were all occupational hazards. They breathed in toxic fumes, handled contaminated waste, and risked injury from accidents involving carts, tools, and even the waste itself. Remember, this was before proper sanitation equipment existed. We're talking about overflowing buckets, leaky carts, and rivers of filth in the streets. And if they got sick or injured, there was little to no support, no sick leave, no workers' compensation, no safety nets. They were simply replaced by the next wave of desperate immigrants willing to take their place. It was a truly brutal system, but the hardship didn't stop at the job site. These immigrant workers also faced widespread discrimination and prejudice. They were seen as dirty, uneducated, and undesirable. They were often denied housing in decent neighborhoods, forced to live in overcrowded slums where disease and poverty were rampant. They were stereotyped and ridiculed in the press. Political cartoons often depicted Irish and Italian immigrants as lazy, ignorant, and even ape-like. This kind of dehumanization made it easier for society to ignore their plight and to justify their exploitation. Even within the sanitation industry itself, there was a hierarchy of prejudice. Irish immigrants, who often arrived earlier, sometimes looked down on later waves of Italian immigrants, perpetuating the cycle of discrimination. It's a sad reminder that prejudice can exist even among those who are themselves victims of it. And it wasn't just about personal prejudice, it was systemic. Laws and policies often discriminated against immigrants, making it harder for them to access education, healthcare, and even basic services. They were often denied the right to vote, further silencing their voices and limiting their ability to improve their conditions. Contracts for sanitation work were often awarded to politically connected individuals who then subcontracted the work to immigrant laborers, skimming a hefty profit along the way. This system incentivized the exploitation of workers and perpetuated the cycle of poverty. Now, it's important to remember that not everyone was complicit in this system. There were reformers and activists who spoke out against the exploitation of immigrant workers and who fought for better working conditions and fairer treatment. But their voices were often drowned out by the prevailing prejudices and the powerful economic interests that benefited from the system. The story of immigrant labor in the 19th century sanitation industry is a stark reminder of the dark side of urban growth and industrialization. It's a story of exploitation, discrimination, and hardship, but it's also a story of resilience, perseverance, and the enduring human spirit. These workers, despite facing incredible challenges, built communities, raised families, and contributed to the growth of American cities. They deserve to be remembered, not as faceless laborers, but as individuals who played a vital role in shaping the world we live in today, even if that role was literally cleaning up everyone else's mess. The cities of the 19th century, as we've seen, could be brutal places, and that brutality often extended to the most vulnerable, the children. We often picture wide-eyed innocents playing games in the streets, but for many, those streets were their workplace, their classroom, and sadly, often their graves. The romantic image of childhood, it simply didn't exist for a large portion of the urban population. Think about it. If the adults in a family are struggling to make ends meet, what options are left? Desperate times, as they say, call for desperate measures, and sending children to work as young as 5 or 6 years old was often seen as a necessary evil, a grim calculation to keep the family from starving. These weren't playful apprenticeships, mind you. This was often dangerous, back-breaking labor, and sanitation was no exception. We've already talked about the night soil men and the challenges they faced, but imagine a child, barely tall enough to see over the edge of a bucket, hauling that same waste. The sheer physical strain on their developing bodies, it's almost unbearable to think about. They'd be exposed to the same diseases, the same horrific smells, the same social stigma, but without the physical strength or emotional maturity to cope. Beyond the direct work of waste removal, children were involved in related trades that kept the sanitation system, well, as functional as it could be. Think about the rag and bone men. These individuals, often children themselves, would scour the streets for discarded items, rags, bones, bits of metal, anything that could be sold or recycled. It was a miserable existence, sifting through garbage, constantly exposed to filth and disease, and it was a vital link in the city's waste economy. They were, in a way, the original recyclers, albeit driven by poverty, not environmentalism. You'd also find kids working around the edges of the sanitation system, helping to clean stables, tending to the horses that pulled the waste carts, or even just running errands for the sanitation workers. They were always there, in the shadows, part of the landscape of urban poverty. Now, why were children so prevalent in these jobs? It boils down to a few key factors. Firstly, they were cheap labor. Employers could pay them a pittance, far less than an adult, and often get away with it. Child labor laws, as we know them today, were practically non-existent. Regulations were weak, enforcement even weaker. It was a system ripe for exploitation. Secondly, children were often seen as more expendable. A harsh reality, but it's true. If a child was injured or fell ill, the economic impact on the family was less severe than if an adult worker was sidelined. Again, it's a grim calculus, but poverty forces people to make impossible choices. And thirdly, there was the simple fact that children were often easier to control. They were less likely to complain, less likely to challenge authority, and less likely to organize for better wages or working conditions. They were vulnerable, and that vulnerability made them ideal targets for exploitation. But the tragedy doesn't end there. Because this child labor also perpetuated a cycle of poverty. A child forced to work from a young age is deprived of an education, of the opportunity to learn skills that could lift them out of poverty. They become trapped in a life of manual labor, destined to repeat the same cycle as their parents. Imagine a young boy spending his days hauling waste, breathing in foul air, his hands constantly covered in filth. What future does he have? He's unlikely to learn to read or write, unlikely to acquire a trade, unlikely to escape the slums. He's essentially condemned to a life of poverty, just like his parents before him. And this cycle wasn't just about economics, it was also about health. Children working in sanitation were constantly exposed to disease. They were more likely to contract cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses. They were also more likely to suffer from malnutrition due to poor diets and the physical demands of their work. A sickly child is less likely to succeed, less likely to break free from the cycle of poverty. It's a vicious circle, and one that was incredibly difficult to escape. This wasn't just an individual tragedy though, it was a societal one. By allowing children to be exploited in this way, society was essentially sacrificing its future. These children, who could have been doctors, teachers, artists, inventors, they were instead condemned to a life of poverty and hard labor. A life cut short, robbed of its potential. It's easy to look back at this era and judge, but it's important to remember the context. Poverty was widespread, opportunities were limited, and survival was often a daily struggle. But that doesn't excuse the exploitation of children. It simply highlights the urgent need for social reforms, for laws to protect the vulnerable, and for systems that provide opportunities for all. The presence of children in the streets, working in sanitation and related jobs, wasn't just a sad footnote in the history of urban life. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem, a system that perpetuated poverty, exploited the vulnerable, and robbed future generations of their potential. It's a dark chapter, a reminder of the price of progress, and a call to action to ensure that such exploitation never happens again. And to this day, sadly, it still goes on. Just not as openly as back then. Alright, let's huddle up close, because we're stepping into the heart of winter in the 19th century. And for our sanitation workers, well, things went from already challenging to downright brutal. Imagine that biting wind, the kind that seems to seep right into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. Now picture trying to maneuver a heavy, unwieldy cart through streets glazed with ice. Every step is a potential fall, every push of the cart a strain against frozen muscles. Remember those open sewers and overflowing cesspools we talked about? Yeah, winter doesn't just make them disappear. Instead, a thick layer of ice forms over everything. And underneath, it's still, well, everything. The night soils collection, that task that was already, let's say, unpleasant, becomes a frozen nightmare. The contents of chamber pots, instead of being somewhat scoopable, are now solid blocks. Think trying to chisel ice sculptures out of It takes twice the effort, twice the time. The buckets themselves, often already cracked and leaky, become brittle in the cold, prone to shattering with the slightest impact. Imagine a sudden sharp crack, and the contents now a frozen slush, spraying across your already numb hands. Bruh. And it's not just the human waste. Everything freezes. The garbage, the animal droppings, the general muck of the city streets. The already difficult job of scraping and shoveling becomes a Sisyphean task. The tools, those rudimentary shovels and brooms, are often inadequate for breaking through the ice. They snap, they bend, they become useless. And finding replacements, well, that means a trip to the market, which costs time and money. Both things our sanitation worker probably doesn't have. The frozen waste also adds a delightful new olfactory dimension to the job. Instead of the usual stench, you get a sort of preserved stench. The cold locks in the odors, only to release them in concentrated bursts when the sun peeks out, or when you finally manage to break through the ice. A frozen layer of unpleasantness that's only intensified when it's broken. It's like opening a time capsule of smells. Then there's the issue of dumping. The rivers, already choked with waste, often freeze over. This might sound like a blessing, a temporary reprieve from the endless flow of sewage, but it's not. It just means the waste accumulates on top of the ice, creating a grotesque frozen landscape of filth. And when the thaw comes, as it inevitably does, all that accumulated waste is released in a torrent, causing massive flooding and spreading disease even further. The cold also takes a terrible toll on the workers themselves. Frostbite becomes a constant threat. Exposed skin turns red, then white, then numb. Fingers and toes, the most vulnerable, can be permanently damaged, making it even harder to perform the already difficult tasks. The constant exposure to the elements leads to pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses. Coughing, hacking, struggling to breathe in the frigid air. Their clothing, often thin and inadequate, provides little protection against the cold. Many wear layers of rags, patched and repatched, offering minimal insulation. Leather boots, if they even have them, crack and leak, leaving feet perpetually damp and cold. And wet feet in winter? Well, that's a recipe for misery and potentially amputation. Finding food becomes even more challenging in the winter. The already limited options dwindle further. Scavenging becomes harder when everything is buried under snow and ice. Markets charge higher prices for what little fresh produce is available. Many sanitation workers rely on meager rations of bread and whatever scraps they can find. A hot meal is a rare luxury, a distant memory. The already bleak living conditions become even more unbearable. The poorly insulated homes offer little respite from the cold. Fuel for heating is scarce and expensive. Families huddle together for warmth, trying to conserve every precious ember. The dampness seeps into everything, creating a breeding ground for mold and disease. Sleep offers little relief, as the cold penetrates even the thickest blankets. Adding to the physical hardship is the psychological toll. The endless cold, the relentless work, the constant exposure to filth and disease. It all takes a toll on the mind. Depression settles in, a heavy blanket of despair. The days seem endless, the nights even longer. Hope dwindles, replaced by a weary resignation. But even in the depths of winter there are moments of something resembling respite. A brief glimpse of sunshine, a shared cup of lukewarm coffee with a fellow worker, a moment of laughter amidst the misery. These small acts of camaraderie, these tiny sparks of humanity, are what keep them going. They're a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is still light to be found, a shared story, a helping hand, a moment of connection in a frozen world. These are the things that make the winter, if not bearable, then endurable. It's a hard life, but it's their life, and they face it, day after frozen day. Okay, let's talk about how the people living in these 19th century cities actually felt about these sanitation workers. It wasn't always straightforward, you know. It wasn't all sunshine and roses and grateful citizens. There was a real mix of emotions, a real push and pull, and it speaks volumes about the social realities of the time. On one hand, you had those who recognized the essential service these workers provided. Think about it: before organized sanitation, cities were, well, we've painted a picture. Disease-ridden, overflowing with waste, literally stinking. Anyone with half a brain could see that someone needed to deal with it. And when the night soil men, the street sweepers, the bone pickers, or the rag collectors did their job, even if it was just a temporary fix, the city was a little less awful, you know. These people, often the more educated, or the more directly affected by the consequences of poor sanitation, like, you know, if they lived near a particularly nasty open sewer, might have offered a word of thanks, maybe a small tip during the holidays, or even just a bit of common courtesy. Doctors, for instance, who saw the direct link between filth and disease, were often advocates for sanitation reform, and by extension respectful of the workers doing the dirty work. And then there were the practical folks, the ones who just appreciated that their street was a little cleaner, their air a little less potent. They might not have been effusive in their gratitude, but they understood the value of the service. The people running businesses, especially those that relied on foot traffic, probably appreciated a cleaner sidewalk in front of their shops. Makes sense, right? Who wants to wade through muck to buy a loaf of bread? But, and there's always a but, isn't there? There was also a significant amount of disdain, even outright hostility, directed towards these workers. A big part of this, of course, was the social stigma attached to the job. We've talked about how these were the invisible men of the city, the ones nobody wanted to acknowledge unless they absolutely had to, and even then they were often treated with suspicion and disgust. Think about the tasks they performed: handling human waste, rummaging through garbage, dealing with dead animals. These were all considered incredibly degrading activities, and that stigma rubbed off on the people who did them. It didn't matter that it was necessary work, it was still dirty work, and that made them dirty by association in the eyes of many. There was also a class element at play. Sanitation work was almost exclusively done by the poorest members of society. Often these were immigrants, already facing prejudice and discrimination. To the wealthier residents, these workers were simply beneath them. They were a reminder of the poverty and squalor that existed just a few streets over, something they preferred to ignore. And let's be honest, the workers themselves weren't always the most presentable. They were often poorly clothed, unwashed understandably, and exhausted. They were the embodiment of poverty and hardship, and that made some people uncomfortable. It's like they didn't want to be reminded that such conditions existed in their supposedly civilized cities. The smell, of course, didn't help. Imagine trying to have a pleasant conversation with someone who reeks of, well, you know. Even if you understood the necessity of their work, it was hard to get past the stench. People would cross the street to avoid them, hold their noses as they passed, and generally treat them like walking biohazards. Then there was the disruption they caused. These weren't exactly quiet jobs. Imagine a cart laden with night soil rumbling down a cobblestone street at dawn, or a group of workers clearing out a clogged sewer in the middle of the day. It was noisy, messy, and inconvenient. And people don't like being inconvenienced, especially not by someone they already view as inferior. And sometimes, let's be fair, the workers themselves weren't always the most conscientious. They were often overworked, underpaid, and desperate. They might have been careless with their equipment, spilling waste or leaving a mess behind. They might have been gruff or surly, understandably so, given the way they were treated, and that of course only reinforced the negative perceptions. Also, there were instances where the night soil collectors took advantage of the residents by charging exorbitant prices to remove the waste, especially if the resident had no other option available. This led to mistrust and resentment. So you see, it was a complicated relationship, a mix of gratitude, disdain, fear, and indifference. Some people recognized the essential service these workers provided and treated them with respect. Others saw them as a nuisance, a source of disease, a reminder of the city's underbelly, and most probably fell somewhere in between, acknowledging their existence only when they became unavoidable, and quickly forgetting about them as soon as they were out of sight, and most importantly, out of smell. This complex interplay of emotions, this constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility, really shaped the lives of these sanitation workers. It wasn't just about the physical hardship of the job, it was about the social and psychological toll of being treated like a pariah, of being seen as less than human, even while performing a service that was essential to the health and well-being of the entire city. And that, my friends, is a burden that's hard to imagine carrying day after day. The 19th century, a time of rapid growth, exciting innovation, and, well, let's be honest, some pretty awful hygiene. We've talked about the challenges faced by sanitation workers, the sheer volume of waste they dealt with, the social stigma, and the constant threat of disease. But now we need to focus on a turning point, a crisis that shook society to its core, the cholera epidemic. Or rather, the cholera epidemics, because sadly there were several. Now, cholera wasn't exactly a new disease. It had been around for centuries, mostly confined to the Indian subcontinent, but the 19th century saw it spread across the globe in a series of devastating pandemics, thanks to increased trade and travel. And when cholera hit a city, everyone knew about it. Imagine this: you wake up one morning feeling off, a little nauseous perhaps. You try to ignore it, go about your day, but then the stomach cramps start. And then, well, then the real horror begins. Explosive diarrhea and vomiting, the kind that dehydrates you at an alarming rate. Your skin turns a bluish hue, hence the name Blue Death. You become weaker, your pulse weakens, your kidneys stop working, and if you didn't get help immediately, death could follow in a matter of hours, just hours. And that, my friends, was cholera, a terrifyingly swift and brutal killer. But here's the kicker: nobody really understood why people were getting sick. The prevailing theory at the time was miasma, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air, particularly the stench of rotting waste. It wasn't a completely unfounded belief. I mean, who wants to be around that awful smell? But the germ theory of disease, that little germies are causing this, was still in its infancy. So cities responded in the ways they thought best. They lit bonfires to purify the air. They spread perfumes to mask the odors. They even fired cannons to, well, nobody really knew why, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. What these guys needed was antibiotics. But these measures were of course completely ineffective against cholera. The actual cause, Vibrio cholera, a bacterium spread through contaminated water and food. And where was all that contaminated water and food coming from? You guessed it, the unsanitary conditions we've been discussing this whole time. Raw sewage flowing into rivers used as drinking water sources. Uncollected waste piling up in the streets, attracting flies and contaminating food. Sanitation workers, often unknowingly, spreading the disease as they went about their daily tasks. It was a perfect storm of filth and ignorance. The cholera epidemics were truly horrific. Thousands upon thousands died. Cities were paralyzed with fear. People fled in droves, spreading the disease even further. And the worst part, it seemed to strike indiscriminately. Rich and poor, young and old, no one was safe. But amidst all the death and despair, something important began to happen. people started to connect the dots. They noticed that cholera was more prevalent in areas with poor sanitation. They saw that those who drank water from polluted sources were more likely to get sick. A few brave scientists and public health officials began to challenge the miasma theory and advocate for cleaner water and better sanitation. One of the most famous examples is Dr. John Snow. Not that John Snow, a different John Snow. During the 1854 cholera outbreak in London, he meticulously mapped the cases and traced them back to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. He famously convinced the local authorities to remove the pump handle, and the outbreak subsided. Snow's work was a landmark achievement. It didn't immediately convince everyone of the germ theory. The miasma theory still held sway for many years, but it provided compelling evidence that cholera was waterborne and that sanitation played a crucial role in preventing its spread. The cholera epidemics forced cities to confront the reality of their unsanitary conditions. They could no longer ignore the overflowing cesspools, the polluted rivers, and the mountains of waste. The stakes were simply too high. People were dying, and something had to be done. This led to a gradual shift in public awareness and policy. Cities began to invest in improved water and sewer systems. They started to regulate waste disposal and food safety. They even started to pay sanitation workers a little better, since they were so important. Though they still faced the stigma and the smell, the work had changed. It was a slow and often frustrating process. Many people still resisted change, clinging to old beliefs and practices. And let's be honest, sanitation improvements were expensive, but the cholera epidemics had created a sense of urgency. People were willing to pay for cleaner water and better sanitation, even if they didn't fully understand why it worked. The cholera epidemic served as a catalyst for change. It forced cities to recognize the importance of sanitation for public health. It paved the way for the development of modern water and sewer systems, which have saved countless lives. And it helped to usher in a new era of public health, one based on scientific understanding and preventive measures. So the next time you turn on the tap and enjoy a glass of clean, safe water, remember the sanitation workers of the 19th century, remember the cholera epidemics, and remember the hard-won battle for public health that transformed our cities and saved millions of lives. Okay, so things weren't all doom and gloom, thankfully. As the 19th century chugged along, whispers of reform started to drift through the grimy alleyways and overcrowded tenements. It wasn't a sudden dramatic shift, more of a slow, almost reluctant turn towards acknowledging the absolute necessity of sanitation. And with that acknowledgement came, well, eventually some changes for the workers. Public health concerns were steadily, albeit sluggishly, gaining traction. The old laissez-faire attitude of every man for himself was starting to crack under the weight of recurring epidemics. Cholera outbreaks, in particular, were a harsh wake-up call, reminding everyone, rich and poor, that disease didn't discriminate based on social standing. So slowly, the higher-ups started to think that it might be in their best interests to improve things for everyone. One of the initial, and honestly, rather feeble steps, was the implementation of some basic regulations. Now, I'm using the word basic very generously here. We're not talking about OSHA-level safety standards, or anything even close. We're talking about maybe suggestions that weren't always followed. But hey, it was something. For example, some cities started mandating that night soil, yeah, you know what that is by now, had to be transported in covered carts. Seems simple, right? A lid on a bucket that could make a world of difference in terms of the stench and spillage. But enforcing this simple rule was a whole other beast. Many contractors, you see, wanted to save a few pennies, and well, they would cut corners whenever and wherever they could. And let's be honest, enforcement was pretty lax in many areas. Another baby step was the gradual phasing out of open-topped cesspools and privy pits, which, as you can imagine, were prime breeding grounds for disease. Cities began investing in building underground sewer systems, but this took time, lots of time. Digging those tunnels by hand was an enormous undertaking, and budgets were always tight. And here's the thing, even with these new sewers, the sanitation workers still had to shovel the raw sewage from homes into those sewers. It just meant moving the problem a few blocks away. So while it benefited a large number of people, it didn't remove the workers from the equation. What about the workers themselves? Were there any regulations specifically designed to help them? Well, yes, eventually. Some cities began to require contractors to provide their employees with basic protective gear. Things like gloves, usually just thick, leather gloves, nothing fancy, and sometimes even boots. Before this, these guys were literally wading through filth with bare hands and feet, risking cuts, infections, and who knows what else. This was a huge step. There was also some movement towards regulating working hours. Now, regulating doesn't mean what we think of today. It wasn't like these guys suddenly got a 40-hour work week. No, but some cities started to discourage completely excessive hours, like 16 morse or 18-hour shifts. It was implied that you shouldn't be working around the clock unless there was a particularly big mess. It's also worth mentioning that some progressive thinkers and reformers started advocating for fairer wages. See, the wages of sanitation workers were abysmally low, barely enough to keep body and soul together. Reformers started arguing that, hey, these guys are doing vital work that benefits all of us. They should be paid a living wage. But of course, this idea met with fierce resistance from contractors, who were naturally concerned about their bottom line, profit over people, right? So these calls for fair wages often fell on deaf ears, or, at best, led to only marginal increases. There are times in history where you are shouting into the void, and this was one of those times. These early regulations, small and imperfect as they were, did start to make a noticeable difference in the daily lives of these workers. Now, it wasn't enough, but it was a start. Spillage was down because of the covered carts. Workers became a little less sick, since they were actually being protected. And perhaps most importantly, these reforms planted a seed. They showed that it was possible to improve the lives of sanitation workers, that it was possible to make their job a little less dangerous and a little less degrading. This seed would eventually blossom into a full-fledged movement for workers' rights and public health. Even in the face of indifference and outright opposition, some sanitation workers themselves started to organize. They formed small unions or associations to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and respect from their employers. It was dangerous to do. They could lose their jobs or face blacklisting for being too vocal. These early organizing efforts were often quashed quickly by authorities, but the sheer attempt to fight back was significant. It showed that these workers weren't just passive victims, they were active agents in their own destiny, fighting for a better future. The improvements were gradual, incremental, and often frustratingly slow. But they were there, tiny glimmers of progress in the darkness, and they laid the foundation for future generations to continue the fight for a more just and equitable society. A fight that, honestly, continues to this day. As people, we should strive to make the future brighter than the past. That includes safety in the workforce. And so the late 19th century dawns, ushering in a period of gradual but meaningful transformation. We've talked about the sheer, overwhelming challenges faced by these sanitation workers, the systemic issues that seemed almost insurmountable. But progress, as it so often does, began inch by inch, driven by necessity and a growing, albeit slow-burning, awareness of public health. One of the most significant steps forward was the establishment of formal sanitation departments in major cities. Now, before this, sanitation, if you could even call it that, was largely a patchwork affair. Often, it was contracted out to private individuals or small companies. The issue with that, as you might imagine, is that profit often took precedence over, well, everything else. There was little incentive to invest in better equipment, provide safer working conditions, or even to do a thorough job. It was a race to the bottom, really. But as cities grew more crowded and the link between filth and disease became increasingly undeniable, pressure mounted on local governments to take action. The devastating cholera epidemics, those served as grim wake-up calls. Those outbreaks really underscored the urgent need for a more organized and comprehensive approach to waste management. So, these new sanitation departments, they were born out of that necessity. They represented a shift in thinking, a recognition that sanitation was not just some unpleasant chore to be outsourced, but a vital public service, essential to the health and well-being of the entire city. Now, setting up these departments, it wasn't exactly easy. There was resistance from various quarters. Some property owners, they balked at the idea of higher taxes to fund these services. Private contractors, naturally, they didn't want to lose their lucrative contracts. And frankly, some people just didn't see the point. They were used to the old ways, as inefficient and unsanitary as they were. But the reformers, the public health advocates, they persevered. They pointed to the mounting evidence linking filth to disease. They highlighted the economic costs of epidemics, and they appealed to a sense of civic duty. Slowly but surely, they began to win the argument. Cities like London, Paris, and New York, they led the way, establishing municipal sanitation departments that were responsible for everything from street cleaning and waste collection to sewer maintenance and water supply. And with these departments came a degree of professionalization. Sanitation work, it started to evolve from a haphazard collection of unskilled laborers to a more structured and regulated field. Departments started hiring supervisors, inspectors, and engineers to oversee operations, enforce regulations, and plan for future needs. There were, of course, still challenges. Funding was often inadequate, political interference was common, and the work itself, it remained physically demanding and often dangerous. But the establishment of these departments, it marked a crucial turning point. It was a first step towards a more systematic and effective approach to urban sanitation. One of the key aspects of this professionalization was the introduction of training programs. Previously, sanitation workers, they learned on the job, often from older, more experienced colleagues. But with the advent of formal departments, there was a growing recognition of the need for more structured training. Workers were taught proper techniques for waste handling, street cleaning, and sewer maintenance. They were also educated about the importance of hygiene and the risks of disease. This training, it wasn't always extensive, but it did help to improve the overall quality of the work and to reduce the risk of injury and illness. Another important development was the standardization of equipment and procedures. In the past, sanitation workers, they used whatever tools were available, often makeshift and inadequate. But as departments grew, they began to invest in purpose-built equipment, like specialized carts, shovels, and brooms. They also implemented standardized procedures for waste collection and disposal, which helped to improve efficiency and reduce spillage. And slowly, the image of the sanitation worker began to shift. No longer were they just seen as the lowest of the low, the invisible men of the city. With increased professionalism and public awareness campaigns, they began to be recognized for their essential role in protecting public health. Of course, the social stigma, it didn't disappear overnight, but there was a growing sense of respect for the work that these men and women were doing. It also helped to encourage the development of new technologies and innovations. Engineers started designing more efficient sewer systems and waste disposal methods. Inventors created new tools and equipment to make the work easier and safer. This technological progress, it was gradual, but it laid the foundation for the modern sanitation systems we have today. Now it's easy to look back at the 19th century and criticize the slow pace of change, to focus on the shortcomings and the injustices, and certainly there were many. But it's also important to recognize the progress that was made, the hard-fought battles that were won. The establishment of formal sanitation departments, it was a significant victory, a testament to the power of collective action and the growing recognition of the importance of public health. And while the challenges faced by sanitation workers were far from over, these initial steps helped to pave the way for a better future, a future where cities were cleaner, healthier, and more livable for all. Being a cleaner back then, well, it wasn't exactly a job you boasted about at the pub, more like something you kept tucked away, a secret shame you shared only with your family and your fellow workers. And yet, there was a strange sort of pride that came with it, a quiet satisfaction that settled in your bones at the end of a long, grueling day. You see, even though folks turned their noses up at us, even though they'd cross the street to avoid brushing shoulders with a man who'd spent his day wading through the city's filth, they needed us. They might not have admitted it, might not have even thought about it consciously, but they relied on us to keep their streets passable, to keep the worst of the sickness at bay. If we didn't do it, the whole city would descend into chaos. It'd be buried in its own waste, and it would reek to high heaven. That was something, I suppose. A purpose. We were the city's guts, the unsung heroes who kept it all functioning smoothly. Like the blood in your veins, nobody really thinks about it, but it has to circulate. But it's hard to hold on to that warm feeling when you feel like your body is falling apart, when your back aches so bad you can barely stand. But there was also a deep, simmering resentment, a feeling of being used, of being seen as less than human. We were invisible men, ghosts haunting the edges of society. People saw the muck, the stench, but they didn't see the man beneath it all. The man with a family to feed, with dreams of his own, with the same hopes and fears as anyone else. They didn't see the calluses on your hands, the way your boots were always soaked through, the lines etched on your face by years of sun and grime. They didn't see the sacrifice, how we were always the first to get sick, and usually the first to die. It was hard not to feel bitter, hard not to look at the well-dressed gents strolling down the street, their noses held high, and think, you wouldn't last a day in my boots. Hard not to wonder why we had to live like this, while they lived in comfort and ease. You see all the horse-drawn carriages, and all those horses mean there is so much more to shovel up. I mean, we weren't asking for riches, just a little respect, a little acknowledgement that what we did was important, that we were contributing to the greater good. But it felt like we were shouting into the void, our voices lost in the clatter of the city, drowned out by the indifference of those who benefited most from our labor. Sometimes late at night, when the city was quiet and the stench had faded a little, I'd find myself staring up at the stars, wondering if there was more to life than this endless cycle of filth and exhaustion, wondering if my children would be doomed to the same fate. And yet, even then, there was a flicker of hope, a belief that things could change, that one day sanitation workers would be seen as something more than just the scum of the earth. That one day, our work would be valued, our sacrifices acknowledged. It was a hard life, no doubt about it, a life filled with hardship and indignity. But it was our life, and in its own strange way, it gave us a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a bond with our fellow workers that transcended the muck and the grime. We were the sanitation workers of the 19th century. The invisible men who kept the city alive, and even though we may have been forgotten by history, we played our part. We did our duty, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough, even if it doesn't feel like it most of the time. It's a strange thing, pride. It can bloom in the most unlikely of places, even in the heart of a man covered in filth. You find it in the little things, I guess. In the way you manage to clear a particularly nasty pile of refuse. In the grateful nod from a shopkeeper whose doorway you've swept clean. In the knowledge that you've helped to keep your city from drowning in its own filth. But discontent, that's always there too. A constant companion, whispering in your ear, reminding you of the injustice, the inequality, the sheer unfairness of it all. The balance between the two, that's what defined us. That's what kept us going, day after day, through the stench and the hardship. A fragile equilibrium between pride and discontent, a constant struggle to find meaning in a job that was often thankless and degrading. But then you look at all those streets, packed with people, going about their day, and if you listen closely, you hear a thanks in every step. And that's something. It might not be much, but it's something. A reason to keep going, a reason to keep cleaning, a reason to keep the city alive. It's the only kind of life you know, really. And you can say that you did your part, you did what you had to do, even if nobody else really sees it, even if they never will. It matters that you did it anyway, because somebody has to, and you were that somebody. And so we come to the final, perhaps most important question. What is the enduring legacy of these 19th century sanitation workers? It's easy to look back at their lives, filled with hardship, disease, and social stigma, and feel a sense of pity, maybe even a little disgust, but that would be a profound disservice to their memory. These unsung heroes, laboring in the shadows of burgeoning cities, laid the very foundations for the public health and urban landscapes we enjoy today. Think about it. Before modern sanitation systems, cities were breeding grounds for disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. These were not abstract threats. They were constant companions, claiming lives indiscriminately. The work of those early sanitation workers, as unpleasant and undervalued as it was, directly combated these deadly outbreaks. Every bucket of night soil collected, every street swept, every overflowing drain cleared was a small victory against the spread of illness. They were in essence the front line of public health, even if they didn't realize it at the time. They were the human shield, absorbing the brunt of the city's filth so that others might live a little longer, a little healthier. Beyond disease prevention, their efforts had a tangible impact on the very fabric of urban life. Imagine trying to navigate streets knee-deep in refuse, the stench overwhelming, the risk of stepping in something unmentionable, constant. The work of sanitation workers, however rudimentary, brought a semblance of order and cleanliness to the chaos. They made cities more livable, more navigable, and arguably more economically viable. Businesses could function more effectively, residents could move about with greater ease, and the overall quality of life improved, incrementally but undeniably. These improvements, in turn, spurred further innovation. As cities grew and sanitation problems became more acute, engineers and policymakers began to seek more permanent solutions. The early efforts of sanitation workers highlighted the urgent need for improved infrastructure, for better sewers, for proper drainage, for organized waste disposal. They were, in a way, the catalyst for the development of modern sanitation engineering. Consider the advancements that followed in their wake: the construction of underground sewer systems, the development of flushing toilets, the introduction of regular waste collection services, the establishment of dedicated sanitation departments. All of these innovations, which we now take for granted, were born out of the necessity created by the challenges faced by those early workers. They cleared the path, quite literally, for a healthier, more hygienic urban environment. Moreover, the struggles of 19th century sanitation workers played a significant role in the rise of public health awareness. As outbreaks of disease continued to plague cities, even the most indifferent members of society began to recognize the link between sanitation and well-being. The work of reformers and public health advocates, like Edwin Chadwick in England, gained traction as the connection between poverty, unsanitary conditions and disease became increasingly apparent. The appalling conditions endured by sanitation workers served as a stark reminder of the human cost of neglecting public health. their plight also contributed to the growing labor movement. Sanitation workers, often marginalized and exploited, began to organize and demand better wages, safer working conditions, and greater recognition for their essential services. Their strikes and protests, though often met with resistance, helped to raise awareness of the injustices faced by low-wage workers and paved the way for labor reforms that benefited all members of society. They were a part of something larger than themselves, fighting not only for their own dignity, but for the dignity of all laborers. So the next time you flush a toilet, or see a garbage truck rumbling down the street, or simply breathe in the relatively clean air of a modern city, take a moment to remember those forgotten figures who came before. Remember the men and women who toiled in the muck and mire, facing disease and social stigma, to make our cities healthier and more livable. They may not have been celebrated in their time, but their legacy endures. They were the invisible men and women of the city, the unsung heroes of public health, the silent architects of our modern urban landscape. Their sacrifices paved the way for the world we inhabit today, a world where clean water and sanitation are, at least in theory, basic human rights. They deserve our respect, our gratitude, and our remembrance. They are a part of our story, an integral, albeit often unpleasant, chapter in the ongoing evolution of urban life. Let us not forget them. So as we draw this story to a close, and I really do mean close because wow, that was a lot, it's important I think to take a moment to really think about these unsung, unscented heroes really of the 19th century city. It's easy, isn't it, to just breeze through history books or, watch a movie and focus on the glittering aspects of the past. The fancy dresses, the big inventions, the important people, the politicians, the inventors, the people who made history. But history isn't really made by just those people, is it? It's made by everyone. By the cumulative effort, the daily grind of, people just trying to get by, and, arguably, the people who toiled in the shadows, doing the jobs that no one else wanted to do, the jobs that were absolutely essential, the jobs that literally kept the city from drowning in its own, they deserve our recognition, and maybe even a little bit of our because, honestly, could you do it? Could I do it? Wake up every morning, before the sun, in a cramped, probably damp and definitely smelly room, to then go out and wrestle with overflowing chamber pots, navigate treacherous streets, dodging horse-drawn carriages, and rivers of whatever else was flowing down those streets, all for a pittance while being shunned by society, and constantly risking disease and death. I don't think I could. I really, really don't. And that's why it's so important to remember these sanitation workers, to see past the unpleasantness of their profession and recognize the vital role they played. They weren't just moving waste, they were protecting public health, they were preventing epidemics, they were in their own way keeping civilization, civilized. They were quite literally the foundation upon which those glittering aspects of the 19th century were built. You can't have fancy balls and grand inventions if everyone's dying of cholera, right? Someone has to keep the wheels turning, even if those wheels are attached to a manure cart. And it's not just about acknowledging their contribution, either. It's about learning from their struggles, remembering that progress isn't always linear, that even as society advances, there are always people who are left behind, who are exploited, who are, forgotten. And it's our responsibility, I think, to make sure that doesn't happen. To fight for better working conditions, for fair wages, for, a little bit of dignity for everyone. Because the sanitation workers of the 19th century, they weren't just fighting against the filth and the disease, they were fighting against the indifference of society, the casual cruelty of those who looked down on them. They were fighting for their own survival, and for the survival of their families. And in a very real sense, they were fighting for a better future, even if they didn't always know it. So the next time you see a picture of a bustling 19th century city, with its horse-drawn carriages, and its grand buildings, take a moment to think about the people who weren't in the picture, the ones who were working behind the scenes, in the shadows, doing the dirty work, the ones who made it all possible. Remember the sanitation worker, remember their struggles, remember their sacrifice, and remember that even the most unpleasant jobs can be essential, and that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter what they do for a living. Their legacy, it's not just about clean streets and functioning sewer systems. It's about recognizing the value of all work, the importance of public health, and the need for social justice. It's about remembering that even the most forgotten people can make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, it's about, appreciating the modern conveniences we have today. The indoor plumbing, the readily available clean water, the garbage trucks that whisk away our waste without us even having to think about it. These things, they're not magic. They're the result of centuries of progress built on the backs of people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, literally. So thank you to the sanitation workers of the 19th century. You may have been forgotten by history, but, hopefully not anymore. You were the unsung, unscented, absolutely essential heroes of the city, and you deserve to be remembered. Okay, that's it. I think I need a long nap after that one, and maybe a shower, a really long shower. Thanks for listening, and sweet dreams.